Welcome to Module 3 and Mastering Global Trade Issues. Now, in this set of slides, we'll talk about these trade issues. We'll also talk about another major institution of the global economy, the World Trade Organization. But before we can get into actually talking about the World Trade Organization itself, I think it's useful to have just a little bit of historical context and to understand this very other interesting organization or part of the World Trade Organization. I'll explain that, the GATT, right? And finally, of course, to understand the purpose of free trade regimes in the first place. So let's talk about that. Then that'll set the stage for understanding the WTO and how it resolves trade disputes. So let's first talk about another organization, one that actually never came into existence. It's called the International Trade Organization. And so this was something that was proposed right after World War II in Geneva, Switzerland. And the idea was, listen, we're going to have an organization that deals with monetary issues, the International Monetary Fund. We're going to have an organization that deals with economic development, the World Bank Group. What about trade? And so the idea that people had, right, this is right after World War II, the United States and its allies had won the war. The idea was we want to promote a new liberal world economic order, right, with free trade and minimal trade disputes and not getting into the kind of trade wars and trade tensions that many people believe contributed to World War II. So they said what we need to do is create a very powerful organization to deal with trade issues. Let's call it the International Trade Organization. This was proposed in Geneva, Switzerland. They even wrote up, a charter for this ITO in Havana, Cuba. This is back when Havana, Cuba was still, of course, a capitalist country and wanted to be part of this. But what was interesting about this is that when the major people leading this initiative brought this trade agreement back to their home legislatures, including those from the United States, brought it back to the United States Congress, right? Remember, the United States Senate has to approve any kind of treaty or agreement like this. When they brought this back, it was rejected. And in fact, the United States Congress said, no, we don't want the United States to be part of this International Trade Organization. So an interesting question is, and I think this is an important question today, because the question is, why did it fail? Why did this attempt to create this powerful International Trade Organization, which would promote free trade in the world, in the global economy, which would resolve trade disputes, why did people reject this? And I think the answer has to do with one of our worldviews, which was prevalent, apparently at least to some extent at that time, and that is economic nationalism. And so I think what you see happen is that governments did not want to give up, or at least representatives, elected representatives in governments that were involved in this effort, they did not want to give up the sovereignty of their government, the legal control that their government would have over their economy, trade issues. They didn't want to give that away to some bureaucrats in Geneva, Switzerland, where they were proposing that the headquarters of the organization would be. So this initiative, right, they didn't want some government bureaucrats in Geneva, multilateral international government executives, officials in Geneva telling them, you cannot impose trade barriers if you want to. You cannot subsidize your industries if you want to, because that would interfere with the workings of the trade system. Well, nobody wanted to do that because they didn't want to give away the legal control that governments had over that ability to do those things. They didn't want to give away their sovereignty. So that's why it failed, economic nationalism. So what happened instead of a powerful international trade organization? What was created instead was not an organization, but an agreement, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And so I'm mentioning this. I know this might seem like historical trivia to many people, but the reason I'm mentioning this is this helps explain what the GATT is, right? So the GATT wasn't an organization, at least it wasn't officially called an organization. It was just an agreement, a multilateral agreement, many countries coming together, many-sided agreement, and forming not an organization. They didn't want to call it an organization, just an agreement. They were not members of an organization, but just contracting parties to an agreement. And the idea was, right, we're not completely, we want this to be a weak kind of structure here, just an agreement, not an organization. And one nation, one vote, and decisions had to be made by consensus. So, for example, if it was decided that a country was breaking certain rules that everyone had agreed to and was putting up huge taxes on imports, that country, in theory, at least the way the agreement was set up, there were some ways to deal with that. But you had to have complete agreement on this, right? You had to have every country in consensus that was a contracting party to the agreement for that to be in effect, to that action to be put into effect. And so countries that had broken the rules didn't want to be punished or face any consequences, so they would not agree with any consequence or any punishment. And so, in fact, the agreement never was able to resolve trade disputes. And so I thought that that aspect of it was very interesting. So nevertheless, the agreement did continue. There was a small secretariat in Geneva, and they did have a way of resolving trade disputes. Let me explain that just very briefly, because it's very similar to the way it works now with the World Trade Organization. But the way this worked with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is if two countries got into a trade dispute, let's say country A began doing something very much against the rules, putting up huge taxes on imports that everyone agreed would not be allowed. A country that was very much affected by this, let's say country B, could bring this issue to the Secretariat of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in Geneva. These are mainly statisticians monitoring trade levels, making sure people are in compliance with the agreement. So in the Secretariat, what they could do is they could set up a panel of experts to review this issue and to decide, okay, was country A, did they really break the agreement? Did they break the rules? And if that panel determined that, in fact, country A had broken the rules, then the way it worked is they would authorize country B, right? The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade rules said that country B then would be allowed to retaliate in kind, right, to the same amount that they, were damaged, right? If they couldn't export their cars to country A, country B was not able to do something like that and faced some damage. Let's say $300 million a year in tariffs. They couldn't sell that amount of cars. Well, then country B could impose some tariffs against country A, the equivalent amount. Let's say $300 million on something country A liked to export to country B. Let's say it's fish. So country B would suddenly impose high tariffs on fish as a punishment to country A. And the idea is country A would be so upset by this that they would say, okay, we won't break the rules. We want to keep exporting our fish. And that would be the way these agreements were resolved. Now, the catch, as you can see, though, is that you needed 100% consensus. Everybody had to agree. So in other words, if country A said, we don't agree with that punishment, the punishment could not be implemented. Do you see the flaw in this? So that is why this was completely useless, this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This weak structure they had just could not resolve trade disputes at all. It was completely useless at doing that. So what is interesting to me is since they set this up, why did it even continue to exist all the way until 1994 when it was replaced with a new and stronger method of resolving trade disputes, which I'll explain in a later video? Why did it last so long? And the reason is that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, what it did is it created a regime. And a regime is just a set of rules and principles and operating procedures, ways of doing things that everyone agrees to. And the idea is if you can sign on to this set of rules and ways of doing things, if there's an agreement that you can sign on to, here's how we're going to govern ourselves when it comes to international trade. We promise we won't break these rules. And you publicly proclaim we have signed on to this agreement. Well, think about that. That creates more predictability, right? If you're working with countries that have at least signed a public document, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and have said, we promise we won't, artificially raise tariffs, huge tax increase on imports. We won't just do that arbitrarily, right? If you have got everyone to sign something like that, then you've got more predictability. you can at least feel at least somewhat confident that countries would be less likely to break that agreement than if they hadn't ever publicly said they were going to keep that agreement, right? So that's one of the main reasons this continued to exist and why countries felt there was at least some benefit to at least signing on, becoming a contracting party to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The other reason that it continued to exist for all those years is that there's the bicycle theory of trade. And so what that means is that people, think about this. It's the analogy of riding a bicycle. If you're pedaling a bicycle, you move forward. If you keep pedaling, you keep moving forward. But if you stop pedaling, well, you won't keep moving forward. In fact, you'll fall down. And so the idea when it comes to trade, if you apply this kind of idea to trade, the idea was if countries would keep coming together in regular meetings of trade negotiations, they called them rounds of trade talks, and kept discussing ways they could reduce trade barriers and restrictions amongst themselves, then they would keep moving toward freer and freer trade. And so that was the idea of having these regular negotiations, regular discussions, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, allowed for this to happen. Countries could, organize themselves and organize these meetings and have every contracting party to the GATT be involved and discuss ways they could reduce trade barriers. Better to be discussing ways to reduce barriers, even if it takes a long time and not much gets done. Better to do that than to just let countries resort to their own devices and suddenly start imposing restrictions and barriers. Better to try to be moving forward. Keep pedaling the bicycle, right? So that's why the GATT served at least some purpose, even though it was completely useless at resolving trade disputes, because you needed 100% consensus for that to be put into effect. Even the country that was going to be punished had to be in agreement with that. And since that never happened, trade disputes really could not get resolved by the GATT. That would take place only later with the creation of the WTO. So we'll talk about that in a later video. And that's it for this first video.